Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter remains in hospice care. His charity center said in a statement he's decided to spend his remaining time at home with family. But did you know the story about Carter's Canadian connection to Chalk River? It's a small community in northern Ontario and one with a nuclear reactor. Just over 70 years ago, Chalk River experienced the world's first nuclear reactor meltdown, and catastrophe was narrowly avoided. The hero? Future U.S. President Jimmy Carter, then Lieutenant Carter in the U.S. Navy. He led a team of men to take apart and replace the reactor. So why is this piece of Canadian history still relatively unknown? Arthur Milnes is a journalist, author, and longtime friend of Carter. So Arthur Milnes, I'd like to start in December of 1952. It's in Chalk River, and Ontario's experimental nuclear facility and its reactor experiences a partial meltdown. Where does Jimmy Carter fit into this story?
Well, you have to remember at that time how basically secret that program and Canada's involvement with the United States and the United Kingdom and it's the early stages of the Cold War. And Jimmy Carter he's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And he's assigned to be the reactor officer as they're constructing the second U.S. nuclear submarine, the USS Seawolf. And he's based in Schenectady, New York, where General Electric is building the reactor. So he's the reactor officer and quite an expert at those early ages, the early age of nuclear power in a military sense. So when the Canadian reactor at Chalk River experiences a serious problem, basically the coolant water fouled up, and obviously the reactor wasn't getting enough coolant. And the fear was obviously a very serious damage, and therefore the release of radiation from the core of the reactor. And future President Carter, he was a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, and he led a team of approximately 20 U.S. naval and other personnel to Chalk River. And they helped the Canadians fix the reactor and clean up the accident.
So when you say they helped them fix the reactor, I mean, that's a bit of an understatement of what happened, right? I mean, they had to, they built a replica of the area of the reactor that was the problem so they could practice on, but then they had to go into the radiation room themselves personally to fix it. Just walk us through what happened there.
Yeah, so as President Carter tells it, they, like you said, David, they practiced. There was a replica of the reactor built, pretty much, and Carter and his men, and they were men, Carter and his men would be taught to, run at the reactor, and each man was assigned a certain part of the reactor, and they would practice removing it. And then when the day came, wearing the 1950s equivalent of safety gear, which, as we now know didn't protect you from anything, they went into the reactor room where the radiation levels were high. And they had 90 seconds, that's it. And they were to grab bolts or whatever they could and unscrew them and then get the heck out of there. And President Carter loved to talk about that experience and how it left him they obviously were checked for radiation levels for months after, and he had radioactive urine for many months, and they told him, the naval doctors told him he would never have children again. And he loves to mention that, yes, but Amy Carter came along later, so all was good.
So President Carter and his team ran into a room filled with radiation,
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
with early nuclear stage equipment on, exposed
Yep.
themselves to the point that his urine was testing positive for about 6 months for radiation, which is an amazing thing to think about. What was the
Right.
risk to the area around Chalk River here in Ottawa if this wasn't done? I mean, can you give us a sense of how serious the risk of this partial meltdown was? I mean, you
Well,
see Chernobyl, you see 3 Mile Island. Where was Chalk River in that?
yeah, we weren't, as I understand today, we weren't at that level. It wasn't going to be a Chernobyl. It wasn't going to be a 3 Mile Island, but we didn't know that
Hmm.
at the time. They really had no idea what they were dealing with. All they knew, because it's the dawn of the nuclear age, all they knew is that they were going to have to learn how to do this. And like I said, they didn't know pretty much what they were doing. And in that reactor room went these men who were in effect guinea pigs. And the main fear obviously would be radioactive fallout, not fallout from the sky, but
Right.
fallout from the accident.
So this is obviously a remarkable act of bravery by Jimmy Carter and the other men who did this. You've written about this. You got to know President Carter over the years. I'm wanting you to tell us about your friendship with Jimmy Carter.
He became a hero when I was a young man, probably actually a boy, 11 or 12. Yeah. So I guess I developed my interest there and read everything I could, whenever President Carter had a book come out.
Hmm.
And then one day I was reading the New York Times on a Sunday, and they had an article describing President Carter, the fact that he taught Sunday school down in Tiny Plains, Georgia, population 635 in an isolated part of Georgia. And he taught Sunday school every Sunday and would meet all the people who came to his Sunday school lesson. So I finished reading the article, and about 25 minutes later, I had a return ticket to Atlanta for the next Sunday. And then I got to Atlanta, rented a car, and found myself sitting in a tiny little Baptist church while watching my hero deliver a Sunday school lesson. To me, you really don't understand Jimmy and Rosalind Carter until you get to know Plains. It explains a lot about them. So the next year I went back, and I started to go every year. I would go and have lunch or dinner with President Carter and Mrs. Carter and my wife Allison. In 2012, President and Mrs. Carter honored my wife and I by staying overnight at our home here in Kingston, and to sit around your own fireplace and talk about the Camp David Accords or SALT II, the nuclear reduction or nuclear agreement, or Chalk River with your hero was just an experience I'll never have again.
Well, Arthur Milne, thank you for telling us the remarkable story about this remarkable life. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, David.